The rain tapped gently against the tall glass windows of the city. It was late at night, yet the lights inside his towering office still burned brightly, as though even darkness obeyed him. At the center of the polished glass table stood the man everyone feared to cross, her boss. The billionaire who commanded with silence, who signed lives away with the flick of a pen. And standing before him, head bowed, hands trembling, was his maid. Her dress still carried faint stains from the kitchen. Tiny burns marked her hands, souvenirs from long hours of work no one ever thanked her for. Her face was lined with exhaustion, the kind only poverty etched so mercilessly. She braced herself for another scolding, another harsh word. That's how it always went. He ordered, she obeyed. He dismissed, she endured. But instead, something else happened. The boss stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His eyes, usually cold and unreadable, carried a strange flicker, something she had never seen before. He leaned close, just enough for his voice to reach her ears. And then, he whispered. Not an order, not an insult, but 3 words. 3 words that froze her heart in her chest. 3 words that made time itself hold its breath. Everything she thought she knew about her life, her pain, her sacrifices, shifted in that instant. Could those words truly change everything? Or would they be nothing more than another wound she'd never forget? The camera seems to pull away, as if the story itself wants us to wait. And so, we return, back to the very beginning, to the day this story truly started. Before that night when her millionaire boss leaned close and whispered those 3 unforgettable words, Elena's life had been defined not by luxury, but by survival. She was born in a small village where the winters were too long, the summers too hot, and the work never seemed to end. Her father, a carpenter with kind hands but weary eyes, had died when she was just 12. Her mother struggled to keep food on the table, often skipping her own meals so Elena and her younger brother could eat. By 16, Elena was already working in other people's homes, polishing floors and washing linens that smelled of perfume she could never afford. There had always been a quiet dignity in her. She did not complain, even when her fingers cracked from scrubbing or her back ached from endless lifting. She carried herself with a grace that surprised many, an inner strength that seemed almost out of place in someone who owned so little. When she first came to the city, Elena had nothing but a small suitcase and the memory of her mother's words. Kindness will carry you further than money ever could. That advice became her anchor. Even in the grand houses where she worked, where chandeliers sparkled and fine china gleamed, she never allowed bitterness to grow in her heart. But kindness did not shield her from hardship. There were times she was dismissed unfairly, blamed for mistakes she hadn't made. Once, a wealthy mistress accused her of stealing a necklace she had never even seen. Elena had cried quietly that night, not because of the insult, but because her honesty had been doubted. And then came the accident, the one that changed everything. Her younger brother had fallen gravely ill. The doctors demanded more money than she could imagine. Elena sold the last of her mother's belongings, even her father's old tools, but it was never enough. She begged for extra shifts, worked nights, and still it barely covered the medicine. It was during those desperate months that she first heard about him. Alexander Hale, a man whose name was always followed by words like fortune, power, and untouchable. His mansion sat high above the city, a fortress of wealth where the windows glowed like golden eyes at night. People said he was cold, unreachable, a man who measured everything in terms of profit and loss. When she applied to work in his home, Elena did not expect to be chosen. She walked into the marble halls for her interview wearing her plain dress, her shoes worn thin, clutching her resume as if it were a shield. She remembered the way the butler had raised an eyebrow, almost amused that someone so ordinary dared to enter that world. But something in her eyes must have struck him, something neither wealth nor status could hide. She was hired. Her first weeks at the mansion were overwhelming. The halls stretched endlessly, the ceilings soared high, and every object seemed too fragile, too precious for her hands to touch. The staff kept their distance, whispering about the new maid who had no family name, no pedigree. But Elena focused on her work, quietly, diligently. never asking for more than what was given. What surprised her most was not the wealth, it was the silence. The mansion was beautiful, yes, but it was also lonely. The air felt heavy with unspoken things, as though laughter had been banished long ago. And at the center of it all was Alexander Hale himself. The first time she saw him, truly saw him, he was standing by the massive window of his study, looking out over the city as if it belonged to him. His presence filled the room. Broad shoulders, sharp eyes, a face carved with the kind of handsomeness that carried both strength and sorrow. When he finally turned to look at her, she had felt her breath catch for a moment, not because of attraction, but because his eyes were unreadable. She quickly learned that he was a man who spoke little, who expected perfection, who seemed carved from stone. Yet beneath that sternness, Elena sometimes caught fleeting glimpses of something else. A shadow, a weight he carried alone. She did not dare to imagine then how their lives would intertwine, how her kindness would reach a heart everyone else believed to be unmovable. She did not yet know the storm that awaited them both, or how one whisper, just 3 simple words, would one day shatter and rebuild everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and destiny. For now, she was only a maid in a grand house, a maid with cracked hands, a tired body, and a soul that still clung to hope. Alexander Hale was not a man who believed in second chances. At least, that was what the newspapers wrote about him, what business partners whispered in polished offices, and what rivals cursed in private. To them, he was ruthless, a man who could build or destroy empires with the flick of a pen. But power came with a price. His life, though adorned with every luxury imaginable, had grown colder with each passing year. The sprawling mansion he lived in was more a monument than a home. Its marble staircases and gleaming chandeliers impressed visitors. Yet for Alexander, there were walls that separated him from the world outside. Once, long ago, he had been different. There were photographs, hidden away in a drawer he never opened, of a younger Alexander smiling beside a woman with warm eyes. His late wife, Isabel. She had been the only one who could soften the steel in him, the only person who could make him laugh without effort. But when illness claimed her life, it left a wound so deep that Alexander buried himself in work, building walls not of stone, but of silence. By the time Elena arrived in his household, Alexander was a man respected by many but truly known by none. His staff treated him with reverence, never meeting his gaze for too long. He ate his dinners alone, his long dining table echoing with emptiness. To them, he was untouchable, until Elena's presence began to shift something subtle within the house. It started with small things. She would hum softly while cleaning, her voice carrying a melody that reminded him of a simpler time. She left fresh flowers in the corners of the halls, replacing the sterile perfection with something living, something fragile. And though she was careful to remain invisible, Alexander noticed. He always noticed. One evening, the first real conflict erupted. Elena had been assigned to prepare the library for a private meeting. The shelves towered above her, filled with volumes worth more than she could ever hope to earn in a lifetime. She was dusting quietly when Alexander entered with 2 business associates. The men spoke in clipped tones, discussing mergers, profits, and losses. Alexander's voice was calm, authoritative, every word carrying the weight of decision. Elena tried to remain unnoticed, moving silently along the shelves. But as she reached for a higher stack, her hand slipped. A book tumbled from the shelf and hit the floor with a dull thud. The conversation halted. All 3 men turned their eyes toward her. "I'm sorry," Elena whispered quickly, bending down to pick it up. Alexander's gaze narrowed. His associates smirked, amused by the disruption. For a moment, the weight of his authority pressed against her, sharp and unforgiving. But then, instead of lashing out, Alexander walked over. He took the book from her hands, his expression unreadable. "This," he said, his voice steady, "is not just a book. It's a first edition, worth thousands." Her eyes widened. "I didn't mean." "I know," he cut her off, his tone firm. Then, almost reluctantly, he added, "Be careful. This house does not forgive carelessness." It was not anger, not cruelty, but it was a warning, a reminder that in his world, mistakes carried weight. Elena lowered her gaze, her cheeks burning with humiliation. The meeting resumed, but Alexander's thoughts wandered. Why had he bothered to explain instead of simply dismissing her? Normally, he would have. Yet something about the way her eyes had filled with sincerity stopped him. Later that night, another clash came, this time not with words, but with silence. Alexander returned home past midnight, exhausted from endless negotiations. He entered the kitchen, expecting emptiness. Instead, he found Elena there, kneeling on the floor, scrubbing stubborn stains from the marble. She startled when she saw him, quickly standing. "I didn't hear you come in, sir." "You shouldn't be here at this hour," he said. "I needed the extra hours," she admitted softly, wringing out the cloth in her hands. "My brother's medicine, it isn't cheap." Something twisted inside him at that. He had spent millions without blinking, yet here she was, giving pieces of herself away for the sake of someone she loved. "You will work yourself to the ground," he muttered. Her response was simple, quiet, but it cut through him like glass. Better me than him. For the first time in years, Alexander found himself without words. He left the room, but her voice lingered in his mind. This was the beginning, the first cracks in the walls he had built around his heart. He didn't realize it then, but Elena was not just another maid. She was the storm he had never prepared for. And storms, once they arrive, do not ask permission. The mansion had always felt like a palace of glass, grand, beautiful, and untouchable. But slowly, with Elena's quiet presence, something began to change. It wasn't obvious at first. Alexander's routines remained the same. Early mornings filled with phone calls, endless hours locked in his study, late nights spent buried in paperwork. He still carried himself with the same precision, the same unshakable command. Yet, beneath the surface, Elena's presence stirred something he hadn't felt in years. It started with the smallest gestures. One rainy afternoon, Alexander returned earlier than expected. The storm outside rattled the windows, the sky bruised with thunder. As he entered the living room, he froze, not because of the storm, but because of what he saw. Elena was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the fireplace, a stack of folded laundry beside her. But she wasn't working. She was laughing, genuinely laughing, as she told a story to one of the younger maids, her hands animated, her eyes glowing with warmth. For a moment, Alexander stood in silence, hidden in the doorway. He realized how rare that sound was in his home. Laughter had been absent for so long that hearing it now felt like rediscovering light after years of shadow. He didn't step forward. Instead, he turned away, unsettled by how much that single moment affected him. Another evening, he caught her again, not laughing this time, but humming softly in the kitchen. She moved gracefully, almost unconsciously, her voice carrying an old lullaby. Alexander paused, the melody tugging at a memory buried deep within him. Isabel singing the same tune years ago, before illness had stolen her voice. The sound pierced through his armor. He almost called out, almost asked Elena where she had learned it, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he retreated, his chest heavy with emotions he couldn't name. The unexpected bond grew strongest, however, in moments of crisis. One night, Alexander awoke to the sound of shattering glass. Alarmed, he rushed down the staircase and found Elena in the dining room, a tray of crystal goblets scattered on the floor. She knelt, panicked, trying to gather the pieces. "I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, her hands trembling. A thin line of blood traced across her palm where the glass had cut her. Without thinking, Alexander crossed the room. "Stop," he ordered, his voice firm but not harsh. He crouched beside her, taking her hand gently in his. The sight of her blood stirred something protective in him, something primal. "You'll hurt yourself more," he murmured. She looked at him, startled by the closeness, by the softness in his tone. For a man who had built an empire on control, the tenderness in his touch felt like a secret the world wasn't meant to see. He led her to the kitchen, cleaned the wound himself, and wrapped it carefully. Neither spoke much, but when their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. Not gratitude, not pity, something deeper, something dangerous. From that night on, their interactions carried a subtle shift. Alexander found excuses to linger where Elena worked. He would enter the library under the pretense of searching for a book, but his eyes often wandered to where she dusted the shelves. At dinner, though he ate alone, he noticed when her cooking was different, how she added herbs that reminded him of home. Elena, too, felt the change. She caught him watching her once, not with his usual stern detachment, but with something gentler, almost searching. It unsettled her. He was her employer, a man far above her world. Yet in his rare smiles, small, fleeting, but real, she saw the man he might have been before grief had hardened him. The bond grew deeper when Alexander discovered her secret. One Saturday morning, he decided to leave the mansion unannounced. He told no one where he was going, slipping into the city with a driver. But fate intervened. At a small pharmacy near the poorer part of town, he saw her, Elena, standing at the counter, clutching a small packet of medicine with one hand and counting wrinkled bills with the other. Her shoulders sagged with exhaustion, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. She hadn't noticed him. She was too focused on making sure she had enough money. When she came up short, Alexander saw her quietly remove one of the items from the counter, her eyes dimming as she handed over the remaining bills. Something inside him twisted. Here was a woman who gave everything she had for someone else, while he lived in abundance. He didn't approach her then. Instead, he returned to the mansion. But that image haunted him. That night, he summoned his assistant and gave a quiet order. Make sure her brother's medical expenses are covered. She is never to know it came from me. The next week, Elena's brother improved. She cried tears of relief, believing it was a miracle, never realizing Alexander had been the one to grant it. He told himself it was charity, nothing more. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. As days turned into weeks, the unspoken bond tightened. Their lives, once so separate, began to weave together in invisible threads. He was the master of a mansion, she the maid who walked its halls. Yet when their eyes met across the silence, it no longer felt like master and servant. It felt like two souls carrying burdens the world could not see. Burdens that, perhaps, could only be lightened together. Neither dared to say it aloud. Neither dared to cross that fragile line. But the bond was there, undeniable, growing stronger with every passing day. And it was only a matter of time before it would break through the walls they had both built around their hearts. The bond between Alexander and Elena had grown too strong to ignore. And like all things too carefully hidden, it was bound to surface in the most unexpected way. It happened on a night when the mansion was alive with voices. Alexander was hosting a dinner, one of those grand affairs where the wealthy gathered under crystal chandeliers, their laughter polished, their smiles sharp. Elena moved quietly among the guests, carrying trays, refilling glasses, staying invisible as she had been trained to do. But Alexander noticed her. Even from across the room, he saw the way her hair glowed in the light, the way her hands trembled ever so slightly when a guest brushed too close. She tried to keep her eyes down, but when they lifted, just once, they found his. For a heartbeat too long, they held each other's gaze across the crowded room. And someone else noticed. Among the guests was Victoria, Alexander's longtime business partner, and a woman with ambitions far beyond the boardroom. She had always imagined herself by his side, envied the memory of Isabel, despised anyone who drew even a sliver of his attention. That evening, Victoria's eyes followed Alexander's. She saw what others missed. The subtle way his gaze softened when it landed on Elena, the way his posture shifted, no longer the cold and untouchable figure he had always been. The storm broke quickly. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the mansion grew quiet, Victoria confronted Alexander in his study. Elena, carrying the last of the dishes through the hall, paused when she heard raised voices. She hadn't meant to listen, but the anger in Victoria's tone froze her steps. "She's a maid, Alexander." Victoria's voice was sharp, poisoned with disdain. "Do you know what people will say if they see you looking at her the way you do? Your reputation will crumble. Your empire will crumble. Elena's breath caught. She pressed herself against the wall, heart pounding. Inside, Alexander's reply came cold and measured. My reputation is not your concern, Victoria. Not my concern, she snapped. I've stood by you for years, and you'd risk it all. For her? A woman who scrubs your flaws. There was silence. Elena's chest tightened, her throat dry. She wanted to run, to disappear, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. When Alexander finally spoke, his voice was low, almost dangerous. Be careful with your words. But Victoria only laughed bitterly. Careful? No, Alexander. You should be careful. If she stays, the world will know. And when it does, you'll lose everything you've built. Her footsteps stormed out, heels striking the marble. Elena ducked back, pressing herself into the shadows, praying she hadn't been seen. When the hall fell silent, Alexander emerged from the study. His face was pale, his jaw tense, but his eyes searched, as if he knew someone had heard. And then, impossibly, they found Elena's. For a moment, the world stopped. She should have bowed her head. She should have walked away. Instead, her eyes locked with his, wide and full of fear, and something else. Something neither of them dared to name. Elena, he said quietly. Just her name, but it carried a weight that made her knees weak. She shook her head, whispering, I didn't mean to listen. I shouldn't be here. He stepped closer, each movement deliberate. You heard enough. Her eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. She's right, sir. I don't belong here. People will talk. They'll ruin you because of me. Alexander's chest tightened. He reached out, almost instinctively, but stopped just short of touching her. His hand hovered in the air, inches from her cheek. Let them talk, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Her breath caught. The words she had held back for weeks, months, threatened to spill free. But before either of them could say more, a sound shattered the moment. The sharp crack of a door slamming upstairs. The spell broke. Elena stepped back, her hands trembling. I can't be the reason you lose everything. And she ran. 4 days after, the mansion felt different. The silence was heavier, the halls colder. Elena avoided Alexander, keeping her tasks brief, her steps quick, her eyes always lowered. Alexander, in turn, grew restless, distracted in meetings, his temper shorter than usual. He told himself it was better this way, that distance would protect them both. Yet every time he passed a room where she had just been, every time he caught the faint echo of a laughter, the ache inside him deepened. The breaking point came one stormy evening. Elena was in the garden, trying to secure the shutters against the wind, when Alexander found her. The rain poured down, soaking them both, lightning cutting jagged lines across the sky. Why are you out here? He demanded, his voice carrying over the storm. I had to, she shouted back. If the shutters break, the water will flood the kitchen. You'll catch your death, he snapped. Better me than the house, she retorted, her words fierce, trembling with more than just the cold. Something in her broke then. Maybe it was the storm, maybe it was the weeks of silence, maybe it was the weight of everything unspoken. She dropped the latch she had been struggling with, turned to face him, and cried out, Why do you care? I'm just a maid to you. The words cut through the rain. Alexander stood frozen, water streaming down his face, his chest heaving. You're not just anything, he said finally, his voice raw. Don't you understand? You've changed everything. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Tears mixed with the rain on her cheeks as the truth crashed between them, undeniable and fierce. This was the revelation, the breaking point, the moment when all their walls came tumbling down. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both knew nothing would ever be the same again. The storm had passed, but its shadow lingered. The mansion stood silent, the air heavy with all the words left unsaid. Days bled into nights, each one colder, emptier. Elena continued her duties, but the spark in her step was gone. Alexander buried himself in work, yet even the empire he had built felt like sand slipping through his hands. And then came the night that changed everything. It was late, The house quiet. Elena had just finished tidying the study when she noticed a folder left on the desk. She reached to place it back on the shelf when her eyes caught the edge of a photograph tucked inside. Against her better judgment, she pulled it free. It was a picture of Isabel, smiling in the garden, sunlight caught in her hair. Elena's breath caught. For all the talk of Alexander's coldness, his loneliness, she realized then that his heart had never been empty. It had been grieving. "Why are you in here so late?" The voice startled her. She turned, the photograph still trembling in her hand. Alexander stood at the door, his tie undone, his face tired but his eyes sharp. "I was just cleaning," she stammered, setting the photo back on the desk. "I didn't mean." His gaze followed hers, softening when he saw the picture. He stepped closer, his footsteps slow, deliberate. "She was the only one who ever saw me for who I really was," he murmured. Then, after a long pause, he added, "Until you." Elena froze. Her heart raced so wildly she could barely breathe. "Sir, please," she whispered. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" His voice was low, steady. He closed the space between them until only a breath remained. "Why should I keep pretending? Why should you?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Because people like me don't get stories like this. We serve, we obey, we stay invisible. And people like you don't fall for someone like me." His hand rose, hesitated, then finally touched her cheek, his thumb brushing a tear that slipped free. "You think this is about what people expect?" His voice cracked, the weight of years pressing against each word. "Elena, I have built fortunes. I have stood in boardrooms where every eye waited for my command. And yet none of it means anything when you walk into the room and won't even look at me." Her breath broke. "Alexander." "Elena." He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers, his voice trembling in the quiet. "I can't stop this. I don't want to." The world seemed to shrink to the space between them, the only sound their uneven breaths. And then, so quietly, so raw that it barely felt real, he whispered the words that shattered every wall, every fear. "I love you." 3 words. Simple, fragile, and yet heavy enough to change everything. Elena's lips parted, but no sound came. Her tears fell freely now, hot against his hand. She shook her head, whispering, "You don't know what this will cost." "I don't care," he said, his voice steady now, stronger. "Let them talk, let them judge. None of it matters if I lose you." Her body trembled, torn between fear and longing. And then, for the first time, she let herself speak the truth she had buried so deep it hurt to breathe. "I love you too." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, overflowing with everything they had tried to deny. Alexander's lips brushed hers, tentative at first, then deeper, as if years of restraint finally broke free. It wasn't the kiss of a billionaire and a maid. It was the kiss of 2 souls who had been lost, and who had finally, against all odds, found each other. The days that followed were not without their storms. Whispers spread. Victoria raged. The world, as predicted, had plenty to say about Alexander Montgomery and the maid who had stolen his heart. But Alexander never wavered. At meetings, when reporters asked sly questions, he looked them straight in the eye and said, "Yes, she is with me." His empire didn't crumble. If anything, it grew stronger, because for the first time, people saw not just his power, but his humanity. And Elena, she struggled at first. The stays, the gossip, the weight of being at the center of a story that didn't seem meant for her. But every time doubt whispered in her ear, Alexander silenced it with a steady hand, a fierce gaze, and those same 3 words, spoken like a vow. "I love you." In time, the mansion no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a home. The halls rang with laughter again. The garden bloomed brighter than it ever had. Elena found herself smiling more, not just because of Alexander, but because for the first time in her life, she felt seen. Truly seen. One evening, as they walked through the garden where Isabel's roses still grew, Elena paused. She touched one of the blossoms, her voice soft. "Do you ever think she'd disapprove?" Alexander turned to her, his eyes warm. No, I think she'd be glad I found someone who brought me back to life. Elena smiled, the last of her doubts fading like shadows at dawn. She looked up at him, her voice quiet but certain. Then so am I. And as the sun dipped low, casting golden light across the roses, Alexander drew her close, whispered once more those 3 words that had changed everything. I love you. And this time, Elena didn't hesitate. She whispered them back, her heart steady, her future certain. The maid and the millionaire. No longer separate worlds, but one story, one life, bound together forever. If you like video, like, comment, and support. Also tell me your country, which country you watching videos. The seasons had shifted. The sharp bite of winter had softened into the gentler warmth of spring. The mansion that once stood like a fortress of grief now breathed with a quiet kind of life. Children's laughter sometimes drifted through the wide marble halls, faint, fragile, but real. The staff no longer whispered fearfully in corners. They moved freely, unshackled from the weight of silence. And at the center of it all, Alexander remained changed, though still carrying the scars of his past. Elena was in the garden that morning. The same garden where roses had once withered, unattended, now bloomed under her care. She wore no uniform today. Instead, a simple white dress, a gift from the housekeeper, one she had resisted accepting at first. But Alexander had insisted. It suits you better, he had said once, almost shyly, his eyes betraying more than his voice ever would. As she trimmed a stem carefully, her thoughts wandered back to that night. The night he whispered those 3 words. They hadn't spoken of it since. The words hung between them like a secret, fragile and untested. And yet, everything had changed. From the mansion's balcony above, Alexander watched her. His daughter leaned against his side, her small hand wrapped tightly around his fingers. For the first time in years, he smiled, not the polite, practiced smile of a businessman, but something unguarded, something true. She makes the house different, his daughter whispered softly, her voice carrying that simple honesty only children knew. Alexander nodded, eyes still on Elena. Yes, he said quietly. She makes me different. The words were meant for himself, but Elena, glancing up at that moment, caught his gaze. Their eyes locked, and in that silent exchange, more was said than any speech could hold. The sun dipped lower, casting gold across the garden, and the scene felt almost unreal, like time itself paused to witness this fragile piece. Later that evening, as Elena carried a tray to the library, she found Alexander there, the fire casting long shadows across his face. He looked tired, but not in the way he once had. This tiredness carried softness, not emptiness. He looked up as she entered. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, setting the papers aside, he rose and walked toward her. Elena, he said, his voice steady yet low. Do you remember the night I said something I shouldn't have? Her breath caught. She set the tray down carefully, her hands trembling just enough to betray her. Yes, she whispered. He studied her, as though weighing every unspoken word between them. Then, with a ray of vulnerability, he closed the distance. I meant it, he confessed. Every word. I was afraid then. Afraid of myself. Afraid of everything. But I'm not anymore. Her eyes glistened. She had endured so much, fought so hard to survive, never daring to believe life could be anything more than struggle. And yet here, in this mansion that once symbolized only power and distance, she stood on the threshold of something she never thought possible. He reached for her hand, not commanding, not demanding, but asking. And for the first time, she didn't pull away. The fire cracked softly, the night air still beyond the glass. And in that suspended moment, Elena realized those 3 words weren't just a whisper in the dark. They were a promise of change, a promise of healing, a promise of a future neither of them had believed they deserved. The world outside kept moving, as it always would. But inside that room, within the quiet glow of firelight, 2 broken souls had finally found the courage to begin again. And though their story had been marked by sorrow and shadows, the ending was not silence, but hope.